Yeah, so I'm Stephanie Wiggett, and I co-own this business with my husband, Keegan, who is unfortunately not here today. He's off doing some other stuff for me. But yeah, we started 4 years ago. I came home from work, and I was just not, I wasn't happy or inspired where I was working, and was like, let's start a business. 4 years later, we're going. You might have looked at me a little crazy. But yeah, we both really just love being in the kitchen. We love working with food, and we love baking. So we started with just cheesecakes and making just mini cheesecakes. And when we first started, we didn't have our food cart, but we kept setting up by all the food carts. We wanted to be one of them. After 2 years, we did eventually get that food cart, in which case we were able to take it out, and we just keep growing ever since. And now we're slowly evolving. Our food cart still pops up from time to time. We try to do a little more special events, but we're now in the works of opening a shared retail spot in the front of our shared kitchen, which should open tomorrow. So it's super exciting. We'll be posting all the details about that on our Facebook page and on our website. It's been an adventure, co-working and operating. But yeah, that's a little bit about how we got started.
So I'm going to just ask you really quickly,
Yeah.
Stephanie, did you get your love of baking from the family, or was it from school, or how did you become such a great baker?
So my mom definitely taught me how to bake. She ran a daycare out of our house, so I always learned how to make large scales. Couldn't just make like a small singular cake. It was always just making a large cake. But I actually kind of strayed away from the kitchen in college. And it was shortly after college, I was in the middle of trying to figure out whether or not to go on and get my master's, or what do I do? And I was definitely trying to balance my budget, so I figured I'd start learning how to cook and bake at home. And that's when I first tackled cheesecake and really enjoyed it. It was an interesting experience. It turned out, didn't look the greatest, but it tasted great. But then I just kept playing around with food and really grew to love finding ingredients that I would get excited about, that I was like, well, I want to put this in a cake. How do I do this? And so I'd read all about it online and really just study stuff, and then just kept experimenting. A couple years later, then I met Keegan. And he worked in food service, but didn't really have a food background. And the apartment I was living in at the time had this big kitchen, and we felt inspired to just want to keep playing around with food. And as we continued to grow, we just kept baking and cooking, and really just loved being in the kitchen, and got to know more and more local businesses, and got to really love being able to source different ingredients. And like I said, then we just kept doing that for a while, until one day I was like, hey, let's try this.
I have one more question
Sure.
before we start. So it seems like a significant part of your business is now involving wedding cakes and that. And so how did that come about?
Well, our first year we did do a wedding. We did a cheesecake wedding, which I thought was really cool. And the following year we did a couple more. We got requests for pies. So then we added pies. And as we started getting into more and more cakes, we started getting requests for not just a little cake, but big tiered cakes. And I'm always up for a challenge. So thankfully, the kitchen that we share with, one of the users there used to be a pastry chef. So she had a lovely background in how to tier cakes and helped talk me through what to do in the beginning. And that was a little over a year ago. And so this past year we did, I've got probably about a good 20 tiered cakes under my belt now. And it's been fun. And some small little 2 tiers, those seem to be really popular. And then I tackled my first 4 tier, and it's pretty elaborate. I've got a photo book up here that you guys are welcome to look at after the show. I also post them, I try to post them all online and on Facebook, and slowly getting some of the ones I didn't get up over summer on there. But I like weddings. It's a little more fun to be a little more creative and artsy. So, but yeah, so we can start with the first recipe. I am going to start with my vegan ginger snap cookie. It started out originally as a ginger snap cookie. It was a little more softer, so I guess kind of like a molasses cookie. And then we got requests to see if we could make it gluten-free. So of course I edited the recipe and I made it gluten-free. And then I got requests to see if I could make it vegan. So I was like, yeah, let's try this. So removed the dairy, removed the eggs, made it vegan. And I really liked the final product. And so I've been making them ever since then, vegan, gluten-free. So I figured I would demo that to start out with. I did not, but if anyone's interested, I can certainly provide it. I'll talk about all the ingredients that we're using, and sort of what the changes that I did to make it vegan, make it gluten-free. And then if you guys are interested, we can certainly share that. My apologies. So I use Earth Balance vegan butter. This one is in the stick, so it does contain soy. There's something I like about it a little bit better. And then, because my mom taught me how to use a hand mixer, we started the business on a hand mixer. I didn't have a budget for a stand mixer. And I've taught myself how to make larger and larger batches using my hand mixer. So I figured, why not stick with the hand mixer? It's trusty, does the job. So we got the vegan butter, and then we're gonna add in a cup of sugar. And when making cookies, I like to cream the butter and the sugar together first. I feel like it creates a really nice base, and it's a little bit more welcoming into all the other wet ingredients. Also, letting the butter get soft at room temp makes this process a lot easier. You don't want it melty because that can change the texture of the cookie, but just nice and soft. So eventually you'll see it. You can visualize mixing and beating butter. I'll try to tilt it towards you guys as I get through the different process. I typically use it like a medium speed versus a higher speed. Yeah? It is hydrogenated oils. I always laugh whenever I have to write out an ingredient list. My ingredients look really simple until I have to go vegan, and then it looks really complicated. But it's a series of different oils. I've never quite totally understood it. I like it. If I'm looking for more of a 1-to-1 ratio, I'll go vegan butter. If I'm looking to experiment a little bit more, I've worked with coconut oils and a couple of different creams, or vegan creams of sorts. But the vegan butter seems to be the easiest if you're looking to just sort of do a 1-to-1 ratio. Works pretty cup per cup. Can be a little bit drier, so sometimes I add a little extra moisture to it. All right. And so, got it sort of nice and creamed. The next step is I do apple juice, apple cider, and then we'll do molasses, apple cider vinegar, and vanilla. So we're gonna do all the wet ingredients. And when I was looking to remove the egg, obviously egg does more than just add moisture, it adds protein, it adds binding. It also adds volume. So I had to try and play around with how to recreate that. So I added apple cider and I added applesauce. So that's my moisture content for replacing the egg. So I had a 1/4 cup of each. And then we're going to do a 1/4 cup of molasses, sort of give that nice richness that you find in a ginger snap cookie.
So, Stephanie, I'm wondering, could you send me this recipe and then I'll post it on our Facebook?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think that might be the easiest to do. So
Yeah.
follow us on Facebook. We have these great cookies.
Yeah. All right. So we got molasses. I like Briar Rabbit. It's a full-bodied, just a really nice quality product. And so we're going to add all the wet products into it. So the other part of replacing the egg is using a vinegar. Vinegar plus baking soda can add volume when they chemically remix when baking, and sort of gives that fluff. So I do, because sticking with the apple theme, I chose to do an apple cider vinegar. You could do a white vinegar. All right, and so we're just gonna do a teaspoon of the apple cider vinegar. If you're looking to replace an egg, it's 1 teaspoon of vinegar to 2 teaspoons of baking soda. And I, just to make it easier on myself, pre-measured out all the dry ingredients, whisked it all together. So the dry ingredients is gluten-free flour. It's an all-purpose flour by Red's Bob Mill. I think I said that backwards. And then it is cinnamon, ginger, clove, little salt, and baking soda. And so we whisked it all together. And we'll add that in after the wet. All right. And so this step, when you mix it in, it doesn't look the most appetizing once it's fully mixed. It kind of looks like it's a little curdled. All right. Just a simple mix. With cookies, you sort of want to, there's a certain point where like once you've got it mixed, you want to mix to make sure it's fully mixed, but not over mixed, because it can make for a tougher cookie. So like I said, it kind of looks a little curdled looking at this step. Not the most appetizing, but definitely delicious. And then we will slowly add in our dry ingredients. And so, sure. Oh, sure. So it's a 1.5 cups of gluten-free flour, and it is 2 teaspoons of cinnamon. It is 1.5 teaspoons of ginger, teaspoon of clove, and then 1/2 teaspoon of salt, and 3 teaspoons of baking soda. Yeah. All right. And so this is kind of a nice cookie that you could always prepare in advance. So after I finish mixing it, I always stick it in the fridge and let it chill. If you're looking for a little bit of a chewier, softer cookie, chill it for a little bit, just enough until you can scoop it. In which case then I scoop it and I roll it in sugar, stick it on a cooking sheet, sort of push it down. I bake it at 350 for about 10 minutes. And then if you want it to be a little bit firmer on the outside, a little more domed like what I have today, it's got a nice soft inside, I chill it a little bit longer. In which case then you could always make this batter in advance, cover it, chill it in the fridge, and when you're ready to scoop it, since it doesn't have eggs, I can handle sitting in the fridge, you know, the day before, etc. All right. All right. And that's that. Ginger snap cookies. It is one when playing around sometimes with different types of flour. I notice in the summertime, if you have a house that's a little extra humid, just watching your batter, sometimes you need to throw a little more flour in with it. Wintertime, maybe adjust it down a little bit when things are just a little bit drier. So it is one that I kind of sometimes tweak based on the weather. Sure?
Could you use regular flour in there if you don't have a gluten problem or you don't care?
Yeah, certainly. Same amount. Yep. When I converted it to gluten-free, I tried playing around with it, but I pretty much just did cup for cup. Mm-hmm. An all-purpose flour is going to make it a little bit stiffer, so you could always tweak it down a smidge if you like your cookies a little bit chewier or softer. Versus a little more flour would make it a little more stiffer.
Do you have to put in a gum stamp on them?
I don't, only because the gluten-free flour mix that I use does contain that.
Okay.
It's a potato starch base, but it does have like rice flour in it, xanthan gum, a few other ingredients. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, but yeah, there's a pretty basic one that's just all-purpose that works. I found works really great when just testing out my gluten-free recipes. I tend to use it cup for cup, and then adjust from there. Sometimes just on flavor. In which case, then you can always tweak I use just a regular vanilla. A clear vanilla sometimes will help if it's not as flavorful. Like ginger snaps have so much spice in it that it sort of hides the gluten-free flour. If I'm doing something like, say, a vanilla cake, I'll use just a pinch of like a clear vanilla, something a little bit sweeter. It kind of distracts from the flavor a little bit. Yeah, so that's the ginger snaps. So in a perfect world, I'd cool these and then scoop them. And like I said, when you go to cook them, you just scoop them out, roll them in a little sugar. Makes them a little bit easier because they are still kind of a tacky dough. And bake them off. All right.
Quick question. So
Sure.
One is, I guess we're always doing an audio check here.
Yeah.
Can you hear well enough?
Can people hear me? Okay.
Okay, great, because it's turned all the way up, so.
Oh,
I never have problems hearing myself, but I figure.
if I get quiet at all, just let me know.
Your specific ginger that you use, is there any spice, like where do you get your spices from? Because I know there's a lot of difference in how ginger tastes.
There is. Right now, I get all of my spices from Woodman's for the most part. My cinnamon, I source from GFS usually just because I'm going through a lot more of it. But my ginger and clove, there's a little corner of Woodman's East right after the salad mix. They have like little bags of hanging spices. I found I really like those the best. And you can buy a little container so you can always just sort of keep refilling your own container. Yeah, all of my ingredients, when I first started out, I bought everything from Woodman's. And then as we've continued to grow, I've learned where to source larger quantities if needed. I still like the idea of doing small batches, so I do tend to still buy smaller quantities of things. But yeah, so that's the ginger snaps. I don't know if we wanted to pass those out or if we were.
Okay, so we're actually going to.
Oh, do two?
pass out,
Okay.
Both the ginger snaps and the oatmeal cream cookies.
Okay.
It should never be called whoopie pies, even though they look exactly like whoopie pies. So, we're trying something a little bit different. If you could hang on to your container, and also because it's flu season, you know, if we have pass them, please be careful that you're just touching the container and not actually. Okay. And we can start serving if you want to start walking us through the oatmeal cream recipe.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah.
Question yet?
Yeah.
Can you use fresh grated ginger? And would that,
Yeah, you could definitely do it. I would maybe adjust down a little bit. Whenever I work with fresh ginger, it tends to be more potent, unless you really want like a super intense ginger. So I would definitely maybe just adjust it down, like instead of doing a full teaspoon and a half, since it's fresh, maybe do more of a teaspoon. But it wouldn't, I don't think it would affect the moisture content or anything like that. Yeah. Sure.
Just about the clear vanilla, I've never used it before, and when would you use that?
I typically use it when making frostings, if I'm looking to not affect the color of it. And it's become handy when you're working with gluten-free stuff. It's sometimes just using a pinch of it just to sort of distract from the gluten-free flour. For the most part, I don't notice it. Sometimes in some recipes you do, like a vanilla cupcake. The clear vanilla sort of helps. It's a little bit sweeter. It definitely can taste more artificial than, say, a more natural vanilla. But so that's sort of when I use it. Frostings, so we'll use it a little bit. I'm going to use just a little bit in the buttercream for the oatmeal cream pies. And so for the oatmeal cream pies, it's the recipe that you guys have in front of you. I was going to demo doing the frosting, but I figured we could talk about the cookie part and then talk about the fun frosting part. So for the cookies, you definitely want to start with a softened butter, just like we did with the vegan. I always mix in my sugars first, and then the eggs, and then the vanilla extract. And then I have the dry ingredients on the side where it's sifted. And that, you can beat it in, but there's a certain point where I like to just sort of start hand mixing it in. It is a really tough batter, but there's just something about hand mixing it in that doesn't make it as tough. Sure?
can this one be converted to gluten-free if you wanted to?
Yeah. I would be careful when buying your oats. that you're buying something that is a gluten-free product. Just because not all of them are. Sometimes facilities process in the same facilities. So I would just be careful with the oats, just making sure you're buying a product that is gluten-free. If you're hoping to just avoid gluten, probably not too much of a concern. If you are baking for someone that say has an allergy, I definitely want to just read your packaging. But otherwise, the flour part should work.
So with the eggs, would what you gave us in the other recipe be the same thing you substitute for the eggs in this recipe if you're gonna do vegan?
Yeah, you know what I would? I would do 2 teaspoons of, you could still stick with the apple cider since, you know, it kind of would blend well with the cinnamon and the spice and the brown sugar. And then I would increase your baking soda by 4 teaspoons.
Okay.
And that should work pretty good because you're still looking for that binding aspect. You're still looking for that rising aspect. And so vinegar plus baking soda, if you ever mix it, say like you're doing a red velvet, when you suddenly mix those together and you start seeing it bubble. That's sort of what it does, but in the oven.
Great experiment.
It is.
Volcanoes.
Who knew volcanoes would one day help me baking? But that's sort of the cookie part. So I didn't know if anyone had any questions on those. It is a cookie I also like to chill again. And so the amount of chilling time can result in either a cookie that spreads out and becomes a little bit chewier, or you know, if you refrigerate it a little bit longer, it kind of holds its shape and become a little bit more domed. To me, that comes down to just personal preference. I like something that's a little bit firmer, as you'll see when they're handing them out. And then so the frosting. We worked hard to try and imitate something that was similar to what you would get in that classic sort of packaged oatmeal cream pie, but a little bit better. And so we're gonna start out with 1.5 cups of butter. And so just take half of that guy. And again, I let this sit out so it became nice and soft. You don't want your buttercream to be melty, but you definitely want it to be softer so you can work with it a little bit easier. For those of you that like to use stand mixers, you can certainly use stand mixers in all these recipes.
Are you doubling the recipe? Because here it says 3/4 cup of butter.
Oh, it's 1.5 sticks, sorry.
Okay.
1.5 sticks of butter or 3/4 cup. Good catch, thank you.
Unsalted butter?
Yes, I prefer unsalted. I typically use unsalted in all of my baking. That way then I can just control the amount of salt that goes back into it. You can use salted butter when making frostings. You just have to add a lot of sugar. And I'm not as crazy about, like I love sweets, but I don't want to add a ton of sugar. And so then I pre-measured out the confectioner's sugar. Toot, toot, toot. Okay. So the first step is to cream the butter. And so this is a little bit different than, say, a buttercream that I would use when frosting a cake. Because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creaming it, but then we're also going to be whipping it to create sort of the air pockets in it. Not great for smooth finish on the side of a cake, but makes for a really creamier, softer cake. And so this first step, what you're looking to do is really beat the butter until it turns a lighter color, almost white looking. And I'm not going to do it for the full amount of time because it's loud. But I would do this for about 5 minutes until you start to really achieve a really light, almost white color in your butter. And you do this before you add the sugar. If you're looking to achieve no air bubbles, do it on a really medium speed. If you're looking for air bubbles, you can certainly go a little bit higher. All right. All right. Have I ever what?
Have you made them into ice cream sandwiches in the summer? Would they work, would it work?
It would definitely work, and I haven't, but I've been wanting to. This past summer, we made our own mascarpone ice cream that I just never quite got around to sandwiching together. But
Not get a sample here?
everybody got theirs?
Okay.
Cool.
great.
All right, so the first step of the frosting, like I said, I didn't do the full 5 minutes. It'll get really loud. You guys don't want to watch me just standing here. But you can already see it's starting to get a lot lighter in color, not quite that yellow butter color. If you do it for the full 5 minutes, you'll really see that color change. And so you're really looking for that. And then you'll want to add in your sugar, which I do sifted. So I sort of pre-measured, pre-sifted some stuff. And so I mix in little at a time. If you mix it all in, you're going to create like a giant cloud of sugar above you. I've definitely gone home feeling like I just have like coating of sugar all over.
So Stephanie, what inspired you to try out this particular recipe? Are you always a big fan of cream cookie pies?
This is actually Keegan's favorite. So he's not here. I was going to make him talk all about it.
He is a newlywed. This is like how romantic is this? The sweetest story.
Yeah, we got married in September. But Keegan saw, we were somewhere in the springtime and someone had whoopie pies, and we started talking about it and got him thinking about whoopie pies and cream pies, and he's like, we should do oatmeal cream pies. And I was like, all right, cool. If you want to do that, you figure that one out. I've got wedding cakes going. And so he tackled it. He read a couple recipes and started working and playing around with it. And he got the cookie all figured out. And then I came to the buttercream, and he continued to tweak it a little bit more. I say I do wedding cakes, but he makes all the frosting for me. I bake the cakes, he makes the frosting, and we assemble it together. And so he was the one, sort of the genius behind this recipe that we have today. Really proud of the sugar aspect to butter ratio. We try to achieve a nice creamy texture. It is one that I usually store refrigerated. But if you're looking to serve it to a bunch of guests, I'd pull it out and let it sit out and get nice and warm. That frosting will still hold its shape and still be food safe, even though it has a little milk in it. I just wouldn't leave it sitting out all day. I have, yes. The first one I did whipped cream frosting on was a Tres Leches inspired cake. I like to use Sassy Cow for my heavy cream. I feel like not ultra pasteurized, but just their heavy cream is just super thick. I feel like it tends to hold its shape a lot better when you're making a homemade whipped cream. Sometimes it can deflate a little bit. For whipped cream, I don't add additives. Oh yeah, sure. So she was asking about whipped cream and asked if I add any additives like a cream cheese or anything to our whipped cream. And if I'm using it as a frosting, I just add a little cream of tartar. Just a little pinch seems to help stabilize it. And then my vanilla, in which case then sometimes depending on what type of whipped cream, if I'm looking for something a little bit sweeter, I'll go with that clear vanilla because then I can use a little less sugar but still imitate that sweetness. If I'm looking for something a little more savory or vanilla beany, go with a regular vanilla and adjust it to taste.
There is a product called Whip It, and I didn't know what it really was inside that little package.
I think it helps stabilize stuff.
I mean, is that just cream of tartar in it?
It might be. I've seen it on the shelves. I'll have to look on it.
It works really well.
Does it?
Yeah.
All right. And so the next step, we have all of our butter, or all of our sugar mixed in with our butter. And you really want to, once you get your vanilla and milk, this is sort of the next part that Keegan found sort of helped imitate sort of that fluffy, sweet creaminess. was just really over whipping it. Like I said, it's not something I would do if it was for a wedding cake or a cake because they'd create air bubbles that's not fun to frost with. But if you're looking to put it between a cookie or sandwich between layers, that over whipping just sort of adds that extra fluff to it. Yeah. So like if you continue to whip your buttercream, you're just incorporating more and more air bubbles. So when you're trying to do, say, a wedding cake frosting, you don't want those air bubbles. So you're trying to cream everything together. For this, we found that we really loved those air bubbles. We wanted to try and keep those. All right. And so the recipe calls for a teaspoon of vanilla and a tablespoon of milk. This is where you guys can also adjust to your flavor preference. If you really like vanilla and you want to add a little more vanilla, go for it. If you want a little more cream, you can add a little more cream. I'm using milk today. You can certainly use half and half or heavy cream. All of those sort of are ways that you can tweak it to adjust to what you like. And we've certainly played around in different recipes. Just do a teaspoon of vanilla. Crap. Yeah. This is where working in a shared kitchen is super handy. So we share a kitchen with about a dozen other businesses. Not all of them at the same time. But we do tend to make them taste test everything. I say make, but they're more than willing. But yeah, so there's some weeks where I feel like I've eaten way too much sugar. And there's other weeks where I could just keep eating them. I made sugar cookies on Monday and then proceeded to take them all home and eat all of them. Because they were delicious. Yeah, and so this is the part, like I said, you'll mix that in. And then it really is the finishing part is whip it as long as you want. Adjust the creaminess, adjust the vanilla to what is your preference, which I think is kind of fun. It's nice to be able to read a recipe and look at it and go, okay, I could do that, and that tastes good, but maybe I like it a little bit different. That is a really hard question. Cheesecake's probably still at the top of my favorite. It was my favorite dessert as a little kid. At that time, we were always just buying it frozen. I really loved it. But getting into making it, I still really loved it, which is the next recipe we'll talk about. I really developed a style of cheesecake that I just really, really love. And so it's kind of hard to narrow it down. I think that's about as close as I could get, but they're all good. Like I said, the oatmeal cream pies are something new that we did this year. They've been wonderful. I always eat one whenever we make them. The ginger snaps are our favorite, especially come the holidays. Whenever I open up those oven doors, it just wafts full of spice. Yeah, I don't know, they're all kind of, it all depends on the season, I guess.
Did you have cheesecake at your wedding?
I did, yes. We had I did. So I made all of my own wedding desserts, which, a year ago sounded like a very wonderful idea. The week of maybe was a bit more than I wanted to do, but it was happy. It was nice to take that moment. We did it. We made everything the Thursday before our wedding was on a Saturday. So we finished Thursday night at like midnight. And it was kind of nice to take those moments with Keegan to just make what we wanted because we didn't have to tell anyone what our desserts were going to be. So there may have been a few last minute menu changes, but we did have cheesecake. I made my tiramisu cheesecake. And that gets topped with a mascarpone whipped cream. So that's one of the times I do add a cream to it. We had those. We had the little mini oatmeal cream pies, some cookies, some vegan cheesecakes. And then I made a tiered brown sugar, bourbon, and cherry cake, which was super yummy. Yeah. Do you have a question? All right. So frosting. So I didn't whip it for the full 5 minutes like the recipe said, but I would definitely encourage that. Like I said, it adds that whippedness. Now this is pretty stiff. I could, if I wanted to, add a little more milk to it, and that would add a little more creaminess to it. If I wanted a little more sweetness, but I didn't want to add more sugar, playing around with your different vanillas is where you could adjust it. The more you whip it, the little bit lighter it's going to get in color, but it won't come like stark white. just because it is butter. Yeah.
Used your white vanilla?
I use this pure vanilla. There are times when I'm hoping for more of a sweeter, kind of not quite store-bought vanilla, but sort of that vanilla frosting in a container. And that's where that can kind of come in. I use very little of this. Like this, I would just do a couple drops of. Mix it in, taste it, and then go, maybe I want a few more drops. Versus like this, I can usually measure out, I want a teaspoon, I want a tablespoon. The clear vanilla is very potent.
Is the white one an artificial vanilla flavor?
It is an artificial vanilla, which can steer people away from it. I avoided it the first couple years until I finally bought it because I was like, I need vanilla, but I need my frosting to be white, or as white as possible. And was trying to figure out how to balance all the flavors. And then discover that, and so we do use it, like I said, we use it sparingly depending on what we're doing. Whether we're looking to mask a flavor, add sweetness without sugar, sort of play around with things.
So the recipe says 9 large or 18 small. I guess what are the,
This is a little bit in between, yeah. You would probably get, I'm trying to think. Yeah, I think it's a little more in between. You probably could still get the more of the 18 small. The large are pretty big. I use a blue, my color scoop. It's a blue scoop. It's about 1/4 of a cup. Yeah, all my notes, we tend to color code our scoops. This was a purple scoop, which is about, I want to say it's about half of that, a little bit less. So not quite 1/4 of a cup if you were to use a measuring cup. Yeah, so that's frosting. Any other questions on oatmeal cream pies? Yeah.
Do you use the pure cane sugar? Do you use granulated sugar?
I use granulated sugar. And then the brown sugar, I use a light brown sugar. If you're looking for a more robust taste, you could use a dark brown sugar, and that would really pull out sort of that richer flavor that you can kind of find similar to molasses, well, because of the molasses. Yeah, any other questions? Oatmeal cream pies?
I always have questions.
Yeah.
So I noticed when you, in your description of the Looking Glass Bakery, you talk about how you would adjust your menu seasonally. So how does that happen? How do you plan a menu? What's coming up, and how does
Sure.
it tie in with this?
So we adjust our menu. I used to do it every fall, spring, winter, sort of every single season. I kind of stopped doing that, and I do more of a spring, summer, fall, winter, just because as a small business owner, I kind of run out of time. But our menu, thankfully, has gotten much larger, so we sort of incorporate all the seasons. And then I kind of look at what's locally available. So on my winter menu right now, you can see some fresh fruit, but I do tend to heavily play on more of your chocolates, your caramels, the things that are a little bit easier to get. Fresh fruit, you can get it, not always the greatest quality. Frozen fruit is great, so we always try to stockpile when we can as much fresh local fruit in our freezer so we can still keep making, pies all year round. And then summertime, I look at what's coming in season. So, I'll highlight, usually a lot more blueberries first before raspberries, strawberries whenever they seem to come in. This year they seem to come in kind of wonky. Yeah. And then what else we can get our hands on, There's the Northside Farmers Market has a vendor that comes down from Door County that brings cherries and a bunch of different fruits with him. He's got peaches. Sometimes I'll see what he's got, and that will sort of influence my more random flavors that you'll see pop up from time to time that eventually will make its way on my fixed menu. I always tell people if they see something that I've posted and it's not on the menu, let me know. Usually can make it.
So Stephanie, what's on your menu now?
Right now on my menu, probably the most popular flavors, definitely going with more of the mints and chocolate. So we have our grasshopper cheesecake. It's a mint and chocolate cheesecake. And then our peppermint bark cheesecake, which I'll be showing you guys in a little bit, are the two populars. We also have an eggnog cheesecake. We use Sassy Cow eggnog. I really like Sassy Cow products. Those are probably the three seasonal ones. We also have our cinnamon chai cheesecake, chai cardamom cake. Cranberry white chocolate cake is really popular. We made a cranberry sauce that we do, and then we use frozen cranberries to candy and put on top. So it's kind of fun. Those are probably the few that come to mind. I keep adding some. My menu, for the most part, stays mostly fixed, and then we switch out some of them. So there'll be a point about February time where I slowly start sneaking all the pumpkin stuff off. Because while I can still get pumpkin, you know, time to work on other flavors, and then I'll add it back in come fall time. Yeah. Oh, that's a good question. What type of baking pans do I use, and what kind do I find to be the best? I tend to use a lot of Wilton pans. I'm slowly upgrading to some more commercialized pans, but I still buy them a lot online. So Daddy-O's is what I tend to use for my cake pans. You can get them on Amazon. But all my cupcake pans, my springform pans, this one's not today. This is a Nordic ware. This was a gift to someone from me. But I use in my kitchen all Wilton brand. I find that they tend to hold up. For cheesecakes, I like the lighter color pans versus a darker color pan. Darker colors tend to add a darker color to your food. So if I'm baking a chocolate cake, it's totally fine. But if I'm looking for something, you know, a nice creamy New York style cheesecake, a lighter pan works a little bit better. Yeah.
What would you consider your cheesecake style to be?
So my cheesecake style, I would consider to be more of a Boston style. Has anyone heard of that? No. I didn't hear of it either until I started trying to figure out what I had come up with. So I like cheesecake, but I'm not crazy about New York style. It ends up really dense. It can sometimes end up, to me, tasting almost a little bit drier and just really sort of packed in there. I like something that's a little bit fluffier, a little bit creamier. And so I started playing around with adding taking out my eggs, adding in more creams, playing around with different creams to still create that structure that a cheesecake has while making it a little bit creamier. So my cheesecakes tend to read softer, creamier, not as dense. A lot of people who I found who aren't crazy about cheesecake tend to be a little more accepting of a creamier style. But yeah, the Boston style is probably the closest I've come to figuring out what mine would be like. Yeah,
Have
and
you ever made cheesecake with the dry baker's cottage cheese?
I have not, no.
It's a really tall, like about this tall.
The-
It's basically, when I was younger, they used to make cheesecakes like that.
Okay.
But I've not seen any lately, and it's really good.
What's it called?
It's called Dry Baker's cottage cheese. Sometimes you can see it in big grocery stores.
I'll definitely have to check it out. I've messed around with adding ricotta, mascarpone, and quark. Has anyone heard of quark? It's a German style. I could be a little wrong, but it's milk-based, but it's similar to a cream cheese without any of the added extras. So cream cheese has a little xanthan gum in it just to help with the binding. Something that you don't find in sort of your European cheeses, so the ricotta, the mascarpone. And quark texturally looks sort of similar, just a little less sweet, but still somehow bound itself, but it was milk-based.
How do you spell that word?
It's Q-U-A-R-K. I found it out of a local cheese producer in Milwaukee. It was up here doing some demoing at a grocery store, and I chatted with him, and he gave me a sample, and it was super delicious. It was a lot of fun to work with, just a little above my price point. So definitely just enjoyed that one myself. But I'm always up for trying new cheeses, so I'll definitely have to check that one out. Any other questions? Otherwise, we can start on the cheesecake.
Well, actually,
Yeah.
kind of a back-to-back series of
Sure,
questions.
go for it.
For the home cook, what would be, I would say, one of your favorite baking tips? And on the reverse side, what would be a common baking mistake or challenge you would find for someone?
A baking tip. So one of my favorite tips I always try to remind people, and it has nothing to do with actually baking, is always bake with happiness. I've definitely had very stressful days where I've gone into the kitchen, it's just been a hard day, something's just not gone right, and I have to go, I need this cake mixed up. And no matter what I do, if I mix it up, it doesn't turn out. So if you're having a frustrating day, your recipe is not working out, I always encourage people to just step away, breathe, do whatever you need to do to center yourself. Desserts are made with love, very much so. So I always remind people to do that. And what was the second part? I already forgot that.
I think you kind of answered both of them in one question.
Mistake? Oh, yeah. It is, I feel like it is a common mistake. Sometimes people get too focused on following the rules and they get really stressed out on making sure, baking is a science for sure. But you definitely got to be able to focus and feel happy while doing it. Otherwise, yeah.
Of course, I have to ask you the question we ask for every single seasonal chef.
Sure.
What was your biggest cooking mishap?
Biggest cooking mishap. I've definitely had some recipes not turn out, but along the same lines of, baking calmly, I had about a year and a half ago, I was baking rushed and mixed something up. The batter just didn't feel right, but I still stuck it in the oven because I needed it done. Pulled it out and I was like, well, this doesn't look right. Tasted it and immediately realized I forgot the sugar. Cake tastes very different without sugar. So definitely a teaching moment to remind myself, like once again, I've done that actually a few times. It's an easy step, especially in a cheesecake. You're creaming that cream cheese and then you add the sugar and then you cream it again. And so it kind of looks texturally very similar before you add in the eggs. And I just missed that step and definitely don't forget the sugar. Yeah. So,
Have you experimented with savory cheesecakes?
I've gotten savory a little bit. Our first year we did a cornbread crust. It was more like a crostini, so we sort of flattened the cornbread out. And then I did a jalapeno cheesecake topped with, we made a jalapeno jam and then candied bacon on top. So it still had that sweetness coming through from the jam, and yeah, but then the bacon and the cornbread just sort of balanced it out. We haven't done it yet, but there's a smoker in our kitchen, and I really want to smoke cream cheese and maybe do something a little more savory along, probably, again, including meat, maybe a pulled pork or something fun. Haven't done that. It wouldn't be quite dessert. Otherwise, I do work with herbs a lot. So I've done a thyme-flavored cheesecake. I've done a basil-flavored cheesecake before. I have a strawberry cheesecake that I don't sweeten very much, and then I add a rosemary whipped cream to the top. Which if you ever want to flavor your whipped cream with an herb, I just let the herb sit in the cream for the night before. And then pull that out and whip it up just like you would a whipped cream, and it's got like just a nice different flavor. I usually don't add as much sugar to it then. But yeah, I'm always experimenting. Yeah.
So my mom was mortified for Thanksgiving because her whipped cream would not come to a peak, and she couldn't figure out what she was doing.
Sure. Sometimes it's got to be cold.
She chilled her beaters in a bowl.
Sometimes cream, I find, and I've had it happen occasionally with Sassy Cow, whipped cream works really well with a fat content versus, say, a half and half or milk. You've taken out that fat content. Heavy cream, you're leaving that in. So there's could have been a bad batch. When I've really struggled with it, that's where I start adding that cream of tartar to it and look at different thickening agents. Sometimes I add a little. The problem with whipped cream when you're making it from scratch, once you start adding things, you kind of sometimes can't add anymore. Like if you add your sugar too early, then it doesn't want to whip anymore. That's something that I've had to teach, Keegan a few times. It's just to be patient, let the cream whip up first, even if it is being really difficult, before jumping the gun and adding sugar or adding anything else to it. But yeah. It could be, but you know, like I said, I've had it happen to me. Some days are just not my whipped cream days. I've had it happen with Sassy Cow before. It was like I had a couple bottles of all the same batch. It just did not want to whip up for me. Went back, got a different batch. It had a different expiration date, and I had no problem with it. So I feel like sometimes cream just doesn't want to whip.
Did she have a glass bowl or a plastic bowl?
It was a metal, chilled metal bowl.
My mother always told me to use a glass bowl, I don't know.
Interesting. I've always used metal. Sometimes we have plastic, like if I need just a small amount, I've used these, if I need just like a little dollop for something. But yeah, I don't know. I've ran into it only a couple times, but sometimes it just doesn't seem to want to whip. But yeah, I would try a thickening agent. That cream of tartar is what I found seems to help out a little bit and doesn't affect the taste. Yeah.
Stephanie, are you going to demo the cheesecake?
So I was going to talk about crust for a whole 9-inch round cheesecake, and then I was going to mix up the batter and sort of talk about how I mix up the batter. I probably won't assemble it just because the crust won't be baked. But yeah,
But there are samples, some
we do have samples. Yeah, I brought, so my cheesecake I make as rounds, but I also make a mini and bite size. So I brought the bite size today, but I figure for demoing it's a little bit easier to see a larger version. All right.
What pans do you use for the bite size?
I actually use a cupcake pan, and then I bake them into cupcake liners. So they look like a little cupcake, just not as tall. Makes it kind of fun and easy. I got into doing that when I started getting into cheesecake. I really liked it, but I always wanted to bring it to parties and events, but I didn't always want to be that person that had to then bust out a cake and knife and forks and all these little things to try and cut up a cheesecake. So I was like, well, how can I make this just a little bit easier to serve? And so I started making a mini. And just because I have a habit of it, I always try to see how small I can make things. So then I made them bite size, and which is kind of fun when you're looking to do a sampling. So like at my wedding, I did bite sizes because I encourage people to take multiple desserts, which is kind of where that can be kind of fun. You can get a couple different bites. But for this one, we're doing the peppermint bark cheesecake. And so I pre-made peppermint bark and chopped it up. And I got a little extra peppermint bits just in case I wanted to add a little extra peppermint to the cheesecake. And then I used Thin Mints for the crust. And I do a crushed Thin Mint, so I just ran this through our food processor. And most cheesecake crust I'll mix with butter, just so I can get it to stick to the bottom. When I'm working with Thin Mints, I don't. Just because it's coated in chocolate. You try mixing butter with chocolate, it becomes a very sticky, gooey mess. And so I actually just press the cookies to the bottom of the tin and then bake that for 10 minutes and then add the cheesecake on top of that and bake it again. And by the time it's done, you get a nice chocolatey bottom that's hard, it's crisp, but it's not too hard and crisp. If you add butter into it, it seems to firm up too much. Like I said, you have your springform pan, super handy if any of you guys have worked with them. Great for coming apart. I did forget the parchment paper, but I like to sometimes sandwich parchment paper down and then wrap the springform pan around it. Makes it really easy if you're trying to get the cheesecake out of the pan. That one took me a minute to figure out for whatever reason when I was first teaching myself. But yeah, so the springform pan, and then like I said, the crust, I would just push. It won't seem like it's entirely as firm as you want it, but it does firm up in the final product.
I didn't hear what you said. What was it again?
It is a Thin Mint crust. So I use Thin Mint cookies, and you can't always get the Girl Scout kind in season. So I just buy the Keebler brand. I think they're called grasshopper cookies then. Yeah. And so I use those. You could always substitute, a graham cracker crust or a chocolate cookie. Pretty much if you're doing any other crust, I would definitely encourage mixing in melted butter. This one I don't, like I said, just because I ground it up, but it is coated in chocolate. And so I'll sort of tilt this. Sort of what I would do, I don't press all the way up the sides, just sort of not my style. A little bit harder to also do with a looser crust. So I'd even that out, and I'd bake this for 10 minutes. And then once it's cooled, pour the batter on top of it, and then it does firm up in the final product.
How many cookies did you use for one crust?
This was about 3/4 of a pack. If I'm doing a 10-inch, I do a full pack.
And then Stephanie, to get it to the fineness to do a crust,
Yeah.
how are you doing that? Is it a blender or food processor?
So I used my food processor. I have like one of those little Ninja things. Those are kind of handy for smaller batches. And all else fails, you can always do the good old-fashioned way with your rolling pin. To get it this fine, you kind of got to work it a little bit harder. When I first started out, I did all my crusts that way because I didn't have a food processor. So we'll pretend like that went in the oven. Meanwhile, while that's in the oven, that's when you can start working on your cheesecake. We'll grab this bowl. And for a 9-inch round, I use 1.5 pounds of cream cheese. So it'd be about 3 of the 8-ounce bricks. When we first started out, and actually up until about 2 years ago, we were still buying everything by 8-ounce bricks. I was very happy once we discovered a cream cheese that I really liked that I could buy by 3 pounds. So I pre-measured that out. And cut it up. And this again, sort of a common tip, I guess, to add to the tips when baking cakes, cheesecakes, things just tend to turn out a little bit better when your ingredients are room temp. So you don't want them sitting out for hours on end. But I usually let my eggs sit out, my cream cheese sit out. It softens it, makes it a little bit easier on your mixer, makes it easier on your shoulders and arms. But it also creates chemically a little bit of a different result. If you put a cold cheesecake in the oven, it's going to take a little bit longer to solidify in the center versus something that's not as cold, something that's sitting more at room temp. So my cream cheese I pulled out of the fridge on my way over here, and it's been sitting out now about 1.5 hours-ish, a little after 7. Same with my eggs. I've got my eggs sitting out, butters, all that sort of stuff. Baking just seems to work better. Yeah.
Could you just go over how you do the parchments again?
Sure. So the springform pan sort of comes apart. And so I will lay a piece of parchment paper down over the bottom piece and then snap the outside around it. And yeah, I wish I would have remembered to bring it because it's a really good tip. But yeah, if you snap the top over around it, you can make sure it can still snap all the way in. And it creates still that nice seal, so you can still bake the cheesecake. But the nice thing is when you're all done and it's cooled and set, you can undo the side and you can take that parchment paper and you can lift it up. And you can get it out of the pan without struggling with it.
Cut it to the circle?
I don't. I let it hang out over the sides, which is kind of fun. It allows me to pick them up, move them around, and then eventually, I can peel the parchment paper back, slide it onto a cake stand. Yeah, it took me a minute to...
I've had it burn in the oven if I've had parchment papers taken out.
I haven't had it burn. If my parchment paper gets like extra sugar or any extra batter on it, that will sometimes, but I usually try to tear that part off. But I haven't had it burn yet. Maybe a way to play around with the humidity in your oven might prevent it a little bit. It does darken in color. But yeah. All right, so we have the cream cheese, and just like butter, you want to cream this first on its own, get it nice and soft. So we have 1.5 pounds of cream cheese, and this is what I do for a 9-inch round. And so I usually do this on like a medium speed, wanting to make sure that it's all completely creamed and soft. The first couple steps are really crucial when making a cheesecake to get that creaminess texture. Otherwise, you can end up with chunks of cream cheese. Yeah. And this is why I kind of like a hand mixer over a stand mixer when making cheesecake. I feel like I've got more control. All right. Cool. All right. So once the cream cheese is creamed, we'll add in our sugar, and then we'll completely beat that in. You'll want to make sure that you're scraping down the sides and completely getting everything incorporated. And so I am doing a cup of sugar. So I use GFS brand, which is a restaurant supply store on the west side. Anyone can go in there and shop though, not exclusive for restaurants. Before that I was using Organic Valley. We had hunted around for a bunch of different cream cheeses, you know, from Philly to a bunch of different generic store brands. We tried really hard to use just Wisconsin cream cheese, so we went with Westby's for a while. Westby's just had a really tangy taste that was a little bit drier and didn't quite fit with my style. And so after a while, we just kept hunting. I fell in love with Organic Valley. Again, that was only little 8-ounce bricks. I even called them, and I was like, do you guys do bigger bricks? Can I get it somehow? Can you just put it in a tub for me? And fortunately, they don't do that. And so we continued hunting around, and we wound up trying the GFS brand. It's a little less tangy in comparison to, say, your Philadelphia. Philadelphia, I also feel, is a little more wet. You know, I'm already doing a pretty moist cheesecake. I want something that's a little more structural. So that's what I use. If you're certain, people also shake it up depending on what they prefer. When I first started this, I didn't think I'd have to pay that much attention to different types of cream cheese and realize different brands are different styles. Kind of made me want to become a cheesemaker. What?
Where did you say that you got that?
GFS. It's at a store. It's called Gordon's Foods. Yeah.
Where is that?
It is. It's on the west side.
Like Schwegler's bowling alley back in
Yeah. Yeah, right by Panera. It's on like midpoint. There we go. I drive there without thinking about it once or twice a week. Yeah, once we hit the point that we were going through, you know, more than, you know, first it was a few bricks a week, and then it was up to, you know, 10 pounds of cream cheese, and then it was up to about 20, and then once we hit that point of, I think right now on average, I'm between 50 and 80 pounds of cream cheese a week, depending on the season. I'm a little bit slower in the winter, so I think I'm only at 50 this week, but definitely made my life a lot easier. I still hand mix all of them though. And so this step is just mixing in the sugar again. And you'll want to make sure your sugar is fully incorporated. And so we'll,
Can you give this recipe to
Yeah.
Tony so that we can have it too?
yeah, certainly.
Small price, it will be yours.
Certainly. I think the recipe I have written down also has instructions on how to make peppermint bark in case anyone's looking for that. It's always a fun favorite.
Tony, you could make them, you could give them out with every Loud in the Library ticket sale.
There you go. Nice. And so going forward, each step that you do, you're going to want to make sure you scrape down the bowl and get underneath the cream cheese and the batter. Make sure you're really getting everything scraped down and incorporated. Like I said, if you don't do that, that's where you end up getting chunks of cream cheese throughout your cheesecake. And that can result in it cracking, not baking a set, or when you eat it, then you kind of get a little bit. In this one, it's a little bit easier to hide because it will have chunks of white chocolate, so no one would ever know the difference. But still makes for a creamier cheesecake.
Yeah, that's an interesting question you just, or point you brought up. What do you think is the biggest cause of cheesecakes to
You know, the big cause is sometimes working. I always start with, is my ingredients warm enough? Then I move on to, how dry is it in here? Is my oven really dry? In which case, then maybe doing more of a bain-marie or a water bath style might help. Sometimes I've added just a little spritz of water throughout the oven. You know, is it winter or summertime? How hot is it in the kitchen? I've tried baking cheesecakes in a 90-degree kitchen is not always the easiest, because then you're messing down, because you could do the perfect cheesecake, you get it in the oven, it's baking the perfect temperature, you pull it out. If it's too hot or too cold, now you've shocked the cheesecake. Or you're not allowing it to cool down, so it's continuing to cook. And so there's a million different things, but I've also felt like I followed all of my rules and all of the rules I've read, and it still is cracked. So a fun little tip for a cracked cheesecake that I've learned is, after it's cooled, just before it's about to go in the fridge, take a cup of hot water and a spatula or a butter knife, something that's a little bit thinner and flat, and sort of use it to dip in the water and then try to seal the crack together, sort of pushing it together, seal it, stick it in the fridge, throw a topping on it the next day, and no one will ever know the difference. I've done it for little cracks, and I've done it, sometimes they just, like I said, for whatever reason, sometimes they just do. The kitchen we're in now, while I absolutely love it, doesn't have climate control. So winter time's always a fun challenge. We're adjusting all of our recipes, adding water when we should be to the ovens. Summertime, figuring out how to cool things down a little bit. The AC works for the most part, but there's just some days it gets a little out of control. There's my ovens plus several other ovens going. Yeah, all right. So we have cream cheese and sugar. At this point, it's looking nice and creamy. And so the next step is the eggs. And I do 2 eggs. It's a little bit different, like I said, than, like, say, a New York style that might have 4 or more eggs going into it. I do a little bit less. I sort of found the sweet spot where the eggs work as a great binder and help add that structure without adding that denseness or richness. And I always pre-crack my eggs into something else. Last thing you want to do is get a shell in your egg or in your batter, and then it's done. Let's see if I can get it. There we go.
Do you ever use a low-fat cream cheese?
I have not, but I imagine you could. You might have to tweak it a smidge. Fat works as a really nice structure agent. Going low fat, I'd maybe reduce some of the moisture, so maybe a little less milk. Because this one, eventually I'll add some milk and cream to it, just sort of to help cream it out. If you're going lower fat, I'd maybe add a little less of it. Because I am self-taught, I've sort of read a lot about the internet, experiment a bunch, and I've kind of learned also when to look at my batter and go, that doesn't look right, or maybe that needs a little bit more. Baking is a science, but I feel like it's also baking with all of your senses. As a kid, my mom never used a timer. She would just go, oh, cake's done, and run over and grab the cake. She also was always losing all of our measuring equipment, so I learned very well how to measure teaspoon and tablespoons in my hand. I love her to death. She was great at multitasking, but she doesn't always stay the most organized. So that was my teaching, and then teaching myself. Now that we're growing and we're hoping eventually to have employees, we're working on how to figure out how to teach that, but also get it in writing. And so eggs in a cheesecake batter, you want to mix them in until they're fully incorporated, but not too much. You don't want to destroy those proteins. The longer you mix an egg, the more you're breaking it down. So I always mix in 1 egg at a time, so I can make sure that it's fully mixed in. And then I'll scrape down the sides. Make sure that there's no hidden eggy bits underneath before once again adding in the next egg. And so if you're making, so this is sort of a nice standard base. This is what I tend to start with a lot of my cheesecake. Sometimes I'll adjust the sugar depending on what I'm doing. If it's caramel flavor, I'll take the sugar down a notch. Or if I'm adding a lot of sweet flavors, or if I don't want it as sweet. Again, if you mess with sugar though, you are messing with moisture, not just sweetness. So we'll get that all mixed in. All right. And so, got that all mixed in. We got pretty nice. This is a good base. This is where you've got this. Now the next few steps you don't want to overmix. So it's sort of when you can get all of your spices, fruit, whatever you're going to be adding to it, ready together. So you can sort of add those all in at once. Depending on what it is, sometimes I'll just fold it in. And shot of cheesecake.
Okay. All right.
Awesome. All right, so for this one, we're adding in the peppermint bark that I made and chopped up. And then sometimes when I chop it up, the peppermint bits fall to the bottom, so I always bring a little extra peppermint. I don't like to add peppermint extract to it, just because then sometimes it becomes too minty. You can always add more peppermint to the top of it if you want it a little more mintier. This one, I'd probably not, only because I've been standing over it. My hair's not all pulled back. But in theory, you could. Cheesecake batter, you can't really make in advance, but you can a little bit. So sometimes I'll have one going in the oven. I'll be working on the next one, getting it ready. So sometimes it'll sit out a little bit longer. I won't necessarily add it to the pan until it's ready to go in the oven, just because like most of your batters, if it sits out, it creates sort of that little skin on the top. So if I'm going to let it sit out, I put a little plastic over the top of it to avoid that skin creating. All right. And so this, we're going to do roughly 2/3 of a cup. I say roughly because I'm shaking it over the top. The chocolate doesn't affect the structure too much of it, but you don't want to add too much because it can make it tricky to cut through it. It won't quite get gooey or ribbony throughout it. It tends to hold its shape.
So what did you just add?
I added chopped peppermint bark. And like I said, sometimes when I chop it, as you can see, crumbs, some of the peppermint bits fall to the bottom. So I'm just gonna add just a little pinch, about a tablespoon more of peppermint to it.
If you were adding fruit, do you have to adjust this basic cheesecake batter then?
I would consider it, just because I like my fruit cheesecakes not to be as sweet. I'd maybe do maybe 3/4 of a cup, depending on what it is. You know, raspberry, maybe you can keep the sugar just because raspberries are so tart, unless you want the tartness to come through. But strawberries or blueberries, I feel like blueberries have such a nice natural taste that are sort of in the middle. I don't want to over sweeten them.
What about the liquid measurement of the fruit, whereas like strawberries would be juicier than?
So then that's where I would maybe not add any milk to this. So this I'm going to add some milk to it to add to that creaminess, and it also it needs just a little bit of extra moisture. The cream cheese is great, sugar is great, eggs are great. Still needs a little something. So when I'm working with fresh fruits, strawberries that you're chopping up, raspberries that might get mushed up, blueberries can sometimes hold their shape, but you kind of want that flavor to come out, so I usually just sometimes mash them a little bit. Blueberries aren't as wet as, say, some of your other fruits. I've tried mangoes. Mangoes are super wet. They work a little bit better as a puree. That sometimes I just did. Pineapple could be really nice. I would do, again, more of like a crushed pineapple, something that's a little bit thinner, a little more broken up, and I wouldn't add the milk to it. The thing to keep in mind with pineapples or even lemon juice is the acidity plus the cream. You don't want to curdle it, so I usually mix in the acidity stuff right away, then put the cake in the oven right away. So it doesn't have a chance. So we can just sort of keep it baking to avoid any curdling. I've had lemon batter where we've tried to sort of save it to see if we can hold it overnight, and the next day it just looks a little different, and the lemon taste just tastes a little too strong. But yeah, so we've got our peppermint bark. I added a little extra peppermint because I like it a little extra. And then we're gonna do our milk. And this is where the teaching part in my experience part gets a little difficult. When I was first developing recipes, I'd add a splash, mix it in, add another splash, mix it in, and be like, all right, that feels right. So this recipe calls for about 1/4 cup. And again, I adjust it sometimes depending on the weather. When things are a little bit drier, a little extra moisture helps it out. Too much moisture though, and it's not going to set, and you're gonna end up cracking it. So yeah, so we're gonna do about 1/4 cup. And so we've got all the final ingredients in here, which is really nice because then it allows us to do the final mix without, again, over mixing those eggs because we want to keep those proteins. And scrape off the spatula. And I'm going to do this on a lower speed. We really want to just gently mix everything in. So this is where with maybe say like a wet fruit, I would maybe start folding it in versus mixing it in. I do, yes. I've found in my tiramisu cheesecake, I use coffee liqueur with it instead of just a coffee. And so then I'll add a little heavy cream. It's a little bit thicker. We're adding that little bit of fat, which helps balance out the alcohol. Alcohol in desserts are fun, but can very much chemically change it. All right, and so then this is the nice creamy texture that you're looking for. It moves, it still has some shape a little bit to it, but not too much. And sort of this is when, like I said, when I'm developing a recipe at home, I'm looking for this texture, I'm looking for this feel, not just to see it, but also feel it through the spatula. Yeah. And in theory, I'd bake this for about an hour. If I'm using, so in our kitchen, I still use a home-style oven for all of our large cheesecakes. And so I'd bake it at 350, I do 40 minutes, and then I open it, rotate it, and do about another 20 minutes. And then I sort of continue based on what the cheesecake's calling for. So you're looking for a little bit of a spring. You don't want to be able to poke your finger through it, but you don't want your finger to like stop. You want a little spring, a little wobble. Well, then it's good to go. Let it cool to room temp, put it in the fridge for an hour, or not an hour, for a day. I usually cool everything for a day. If you're baking with alcohol, definitely a day. For whatever reason, like my grasshopper cheesecakes, everything else, it just really, I'd always pull in it a little bit earlier than a day, and it just didn't want to set. If I gave it just like a few more hours, then it seemed fine, so.
So you always make it without water unless you're having an issue?
I do. Just because I'm doing a creamier style, so if I'm baking with water and there's extra humidity in the air, then I'm adding more moisture to the cake that's already pretty moist. If I was doing, say, a very traditional New York style, I'd be way more into the idea of doing that water bath. Yeah.
Is this, you said that when you put spices in, so would you soak, like you did a lavender cake that one time, it was delicious. And would you soak that lavender in the milk then overnight, or how would you get it? You don't want to.
You don't, yeah. I'm not as crazy when using floral about using extracts or oils. They work great, but sometimes they can be too intense. So lavender, I really like using dried lavender, in which case you can let it sit in the milk overnight, measure out your milk, maybe a little bit extra just because the dried lavender is bound to soak it up a little bit. And then let it sit. Usually a day is good. I've done that with my chai cheesecake. I let the chai sit in the milk overnight. I don't heat the milk up to let it steep in it. Instead, I let it just do a really long soak. Something about heating milk up, again, changes it, and it feels like it loses its fat, it loses its structure, which we don't want to keep. Yeah?
I have a question about baking pies.
Sure.
Fruit pies. I've been baking for many, many years, and I've never had this problem until I moved here to Madison, and I don't know if it's I'm using different pans, or if it's an oven, or if what it is. But I've noticed that it feels like the bottom crust tastes raw when the pie is done. Everything is brown, and it's been in there long
Sure.
as it needs to be, and everything looks perfect, and the pie is delicious, but to me,
It still feels
that
raw.
crust on the bottom, it's like it didn't cook through. So is it,
It could be an oven thing. It could be a slightly different pan. I know baking in glass to baking in metal, it's very different. And even the type of metal. If you're using a very thin metal versus like a tin versus a thicker metal. Same with color of the metal. All of those factor into your cook times and how it's going to turn out. Now fruit pies, because you're covering it, you can't do a par bake on them, which is unfortunate. I would maybe encourage perhaps adding a little flour to the bottom before putting your fruit on top of it. Maybe there's a chance that your fruit filling just is a little extra wet, or it could just be a habit, or because the oven or the pan might be a little different, that fruit has time to really soak into that bottom. Yeah.
A friend of mine told me that they used to sprinkle some
Okay.
instant tapioca in the bottom
Oh,
before they put the fruit in. And then a lady I used to work with said her grandma always sliced the apple up in the bottom and covered the bottom of the pie with that.
nice.
I don't know, that's just a couple little things that,
Also,
Sure.
placement in your oven, if you have it on a lower shelf than the bottom. would be
yeah.
flat.
Yeah.
If you,
Lower?
yeah.
One way to prevent the top from browning too, if you feel like the bottom's just not down, is cover with tin foil. And you can do the edges, or I've done sometimes just the whole top.
Do you prefer glass or metal yourself anyways?
When I first started out, I thought glass was the best, and then I've converted to metal. Metal is a little bit thinner sometimes, and it conducts heat a little bit different, but I found I have a little bit more consistency in it. Maybe it's just because that's what I'm using on all of my pans, so now I know what it's working. But I do prefer metal.
We have time for one more question and then a couple announcements. So, anyone have I love the fact that you're like this baking psychic for people. You do such a fantastic job.
I've made a lot of errors along the way.
Our last question?
It seems like every time I bake a cheesecake, and there are different styles, but it's the baking time. I always seem to have to keep it in longer in the oven than the recipe baking time sucks. I don't know, they say, oh, it should have a little jiggle, but it always looks really jiggly. And, really jiggly. And so
Sure.
it's like, I gotta get rid of that jiggle, and
Um,
I'm afraid of over baking, and I
So it could be, multiple different things. It could be that your oven, you think it's running at 350, it could be running at, say, 348 or 3 something. Ovens always sometimes get a little wonky. I always add an extra thermometer inside my oven just to verify things. But when I first started out, I was the same way. And now I kind of have a method with my own base recipe. But I do feel like cheesecakes take a long time. I've had cheesecakes bake for an hour and a half sometimes. There are a certain point with some of them, and I found it more with, like I said, the alcohol-based ones seem to act a little different, where sometimes they just look like they are just straight up not done and they're jiggling. But when I put my ear closer to it, I can hear it's boiling. If you can hear it boiling, you've gone too far. Now you've overcooked the center. So you don't want to get to that point. So sometimes if it looks like it's just too jiggly, but it seems like it's done, you can always try pulling it out and see. As long as the cheesecake has reached 165 degrees inside, egg, everything, that the dairy, all of that is completely safe. You've killed all the bacteria off. So worst case scenario, you've pulled it out and it just is a little soft in the center. But yeah.
So do you recommend taking its temperature?
I tried it a few times. I have a little heat gun that I found on Amazon. I shop on Amazon sometimes. I'm sorry. I think it was like $15. Allows me to sometimes check the temperature of my oven while I'm doing things, which has been handy. With like flourless chocolate cake, you can't bake it till you can stick a toothpick in it. So you're, again, that's something that you're looking for a jiggle. You're looking for an internal temperature. So it's kind of handy.
Hey, well, I'd like us to give a great big hand to a wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you guys.